Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from St. Francisville, Louisiana. Thank you so very much for joining us, and welcome to 2K22, 2022. This is our first class of the new Gregorian year, if you keep track of such things, as most in the world do. This is the 15th class in our ongoing series, A New Look at the Pentateuch. We are working through the Bible's first 5 books, the Pentateuch, as it means in Greek, and we're following the annual cycle of Torah readings that are found on your Jewish calendar, which many of you have. This also is the second class in, I guess, what you would call a series within the series. We are now working through the second book of the 5, through the book of Exodus, as it's called. Shemot is the Hebrew name of that book, a book title which means names. So we're working in the book of names. Last week we did the Torah reading, or the Pentateuch reading, that is also called names because it is based on the first significant word in the book. These are the names, Ve'ele. Today's reading is Va'era, which in English means, and I appeared. And I appeared. It begins in Genesis chapter 6 and in Exodus chapter 6 and verse 2. And it goes through Exodus chapter 9, the end of chapter 9, the final verse, verse 35. So Exodus chapter 6, verse 2 through 9:35 is the reading called Va'era. We're in the book of names. Now, last week, speaking of names, I gave several examples which I found to be somewhat striking. You have a book that's called the Book of Names, a reading that's designated, these are the names, and you get a lot of people that you're introduced to, but you don't catch their names. You ever hear somebody say, I didn't catch your name? Well, we didn't catch the names of a lot of the key characters that are mentioned in that opening section. We don't know if we only read the opening chapters of Exodus. We don't know the names of the father and mother, a certain Levite couple. The man is a Levite, the woman is a Levite. We don't know their names. Now, we learn them later, but at the time, you're not introduced. You just read in Exodus, the beginning of Exodus, that a certain Levite marries a certain Levite woman, and they give birth to a son. And later, we get a name for this particular person. But we have several people in the opening chapters where the reader encounters a character, we don't have a name for him. Now, one of the examples, and this is where I'm going to start this morning, because one of the examples, going back to last week's reading, of people that we meet for whom we have no name, is the Pharaoh. Now, why? The question that I open with this morning is, why is it that such an important detail is left out of the narrative? We were discussing this morning before I went live. Who is the Pharaoh of the Exodus? I mean, there are a lot of theories, there are a lot of great books, a lot of good reading written by brilliant people, past and present, who argue for this Pharaoh or that Pharaoh, and but that's an important detail. You would think that someone writing the history would have reported the name. I mean, it would certainly help us in the narrowing down when we talk about, we're trying to figure out the window of time during which the Exodus takes place. This is a watershed event, not only in biblical history, but it's absolutely bedrock, foundational, fundamental. You take this story out, what do you have? I mean, this is the core of biblical faith, and we don't even know who the Pharaoh is. Now, there are a lot of debates, there are a lot of candidates, and a lot of them are really good candidates. Last week we met this person. Last week we met this particular Pharaoh, but we didn't catch his name. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. And when we meet this particular Pharaoh, the one we don't know his name, it's at the beginning of Exodus, and all we know, this is what we know about this person, is that a new king arose over Egypt who didn't know Joseph. All right, so we begin to make a list of what do we know, what do we not know. Now, again, look, there are brilliant people who have staked a lot, their scholarly credentials and so forth, on this is the time, this is the person. I've got it, I know it, just read my book. From our biblical records, it's this newly crowned, I'm using crowned, but this newly risen ruler is probably a better way to put it, that initiated several oppressive and I would say cruel edicts, taking positions. And what we know is that this person, this ruler, this king, this Pharaoh, takes positions that the historian of the book of Exodus is wanting us to realize these positions this new king is putting into effect are new. They're not something that was going on prior, or they wouldn't be mentioned, right? It basically says this new king arises, and then you start reading those things which were put into place, particularly when it regards people of foreign birth. You know, he begins to enact certain rulings and certain oppressive edicts against these foreigners who are living there. Particularly, we are introduced to this idea that taskmasters are placed over the Hebrew people, over the children of Israel, these taskmasters. Now, an interesting thing, and I'm not going to go into this today so much, but the language is very similar to that which we encounter in the monarchy period, particularly when we look at the history of Solomon, because Solomon also enacted certain things against the northern tribes, such as the same word, you'll find the same word that's used for taskmasters among the Egyptians. You'll find that also in the book of Kings, what Solomon places over these northern tribes. Same Hebrew word. But basically, one of the things that happens is that the children of Israel are placed into what we call corvée labor. They're enslaved, they're oppressed, and they are forced to participate in massive building projects. And one of the things that I want to share with you today, it's a little bit different, class, because this week I spent a lot of time looking at Egyptian text and from history that I have in my library here, and really doing some study, looking for things which correlate, whether they match the exact time or not, but correlate or corroborate even the biblical story of foreigners, particularly of Semitic origin, in Egypt. All right? Now, these cruel and oppressive edicts and cruel and oppressive measures that were taken against the Hebrews were all meant to do this. They were meant to, A, subject the Hebrew people to the rule of Pharaoh and to put them under that heel, if you will, H-E-E-L, but they also were meant to curb the growth of the people. Remember, if you open up the book of Exodus and you begin to read, one of the things that it talks about is this people who dwell in our midst are increasing rapidly. They're growing, their families, there are lots of kids, there are, lots and lots of people. And the concern was that the children of Israel, that if an enemy came to attack, that these people would join up with the enemies of the Egyptians, and it would be sort of a takeover from the midst of the land of Egypt, which is a dangerous thing. So the ruler puts these measures into place. But the efforts failed. Despite the oppression, despite the enslavement, despite all the practices that the Pharaoh would put over these children of Israel, they multiplied even more. Next, in an attempt to curb this problem of the growth, the Pharaoh also puts out that you should kill first to the midwives. We know 2 of them, but we know that 2 midwives couldn't possibly service a group as big as the nation of Israel, particularly as it is described in our text. But Shiphrah and Puah are 2 that are mentioned. Last week we talked about this. Are they Egyptian? Are they Hebrew? There's a debate both ways. Josephus weighs in on it, Abravanel, many other commentators weigh in on this. The answer is we don't know. We have theories, but they feared God and they didn't follow through with the charge of the Pharaoh to kill these Hebrew boys. The command was then given to the people at large that anyone who knows of the birth of a boy, Hebrew, needs to off the child, expose the child to the Nile. But it's this story which sets the stage for the birth of the great deliverer, and that was my class last week. The birth of a deliverer in the book of Names is called by the name Moses, Moshe in Hebrew. We talked about that the idea of Moshe in Hebrew is tied to a Hebrew word which can be, it sounds like a word which means drawn from. So the idea is that this Egyptian princess, and I have no doubt that she would have known Hebrew. She's around these Hebrew people all the time. But she associates the name, this is the way the story goes, at least according to the Hebrew etiology, we call it. The baby is drawn from the water, so he is called Drew. That's my English pun. Actually, it's Moshitu, drawn from, I drew him from the water, so I will call him Moshe. But also the name means in Egyptian, Moses, and Mose means born of, or the son of. So what we get is, we get this name in all sorts of Egyptian names. Ramesses, you hear the Messes on the end is from the same Egyptian root. It means born of Ra. Tutmosis means born of Tut or son of Tut, something of that nature. But we have an unnamed Pharaoh. And this unnamed Pharaoh, or the fact that we have a Pharaoh with no name, is used by minimalists the world over to suggest that this is a problem. That might be an inconvenience, but is it a problem? Is the fact that we don't know the name of the Pharaoh, is that indicative of a text which is not truthful? So, for instance, some have suggested and put forward the idea that the reason we don't know the Pharaoh of the Exodus, at least it's not recorded in Scripture, some have put forward the idea that perhaps, suggest they, this was written at a period so much later that the name had slipped. We just don't recall the name. We just know he was Pharaoh. And that's what some have suggested. Some suggest that the whole story is based on myth, that like Moses, whose name means son of, and then nothing, right? There's the son of who? We don't know. We found him in the water. Now, some suggest that the whole story is made up, and they've used other comparative studies from other ancient Near documents of the hero, the deliverer who's pulled out of the water. Often the similarities are interesting, such as in a reed basket. You can read about Sargon and some of these other ancient stories. But is that true? Is it so? Should we expect to find the name of the Pharaoh in a text that dates to the period that concerns us? Now remember, without being too dogmatic on this, if you go by 1 Kings chapter 6 and verse 1, in fact, we'll look there first just in case you have forgotten this. 1 Kings chapter 6 verse 1 gives this bit of information. And it's really the biblical clue. Now, it still requires interpretation and understanding based on other sources, but this is sort of the text which gives us an idea of when the Exodus took place. You ready? In the 480th year after the Israelites left the land of Egypt, in the month of Ziv, which is also known as ER, it's the second month. That is the second month. In the 4th year of his reign over Israel, Solomon began to build the house of Jehovah. And it describes the building of that house. Now, based on the chronology of Tyrian kings and Josephus and Assyrio-Tyrian synchronisms, the 4th year of Solomon's reign is generally, notice, underlined, highlighted, generally dated at 968 BCE, 968 before the Common Era. So this is the 4th year of Solomon's reign, 968. Well, what did we read here? That year was the 480th year after Israel left Egypt. So that would date the Exodus at 1448. Now, I'm not going to quabble over a couple of years here or there, but generally, this is the date that is ascribed by people who want to be literal and stick with what we know from the Bible and not entertain a lot of other ideas. Now, believe me, there are vast differences in dating schemes. Most of the scholars would put it 12th century BC, 13th, 12th century BCE for the Exodus. We're talking much later, a couple hundred years later. Well, when you get into the conquest, for instance, and you begin to look at, say, the archaeology put forward by Catherine Kenyon, the dating of the destruction of Jericho and so forth, what happens is people from the academic community, they put a stake in the ground in concrete and they say, we date the Exodus in the 12th century, give or take a little bit, and therefore the Jericho happened before they left, right? So you can see that would create a problem. But what if they're wrong? See, this is the point. So I date it, 1448 is my working number. Now, I've entertained some numbers that are much earlier than that, but I'm not going to get into those at this time. But this particular time, let's say 1448, and again, you know, a lot of people, one more point, some people associate it in the 1550s and they tie in the Hyksos and so forth. There are reasons that I've studied that deeply. I'm not going to go there right now. But here's what I want you to know. This time, 1448, let's say, into the 1500s, corresponds to what we call the 18th dynasty in Egypt. Now, I'm going to get into a lot of things today. We're going to do biblical text too, but I want to give you some of the Egyptian backstory and information that I think is important. But if you're looking at this particular time frame, we call it in some, again, debates on this as well, but let's call it the 18th dynasty in Egypt. And that time frame for the 18th dynasty is, say, 1550 BCE to 1295 BCE, right? So that's kind of the frame, and I'm looking at that window and I'm saying that falls in about where I think, for what it's worth, the Exodus occurred, 1550 to 1295. And again, some debate the King's List in Egypt, and there's new chronology and old chronology, and believe me, it's far more than I can go into in one sitting. You wouldn't allow it. You would find something better to do with your time, I assure you. So we're going to talk about a Pharaoh We don't know his name. And I wanted to bring up a couple of points to give you some context. In Hebrew, Pharaoh, I take a lot of ribs for the way I pronounce that, and that is the proper English. We don't call it the Queen's English here in Louisiana, but Pharaoh, a lot of people think I emphasize that too much. But in Hebrew, Pharaoh is Paro. Paro. And in Egyptian, you will encounter Pera. It's similar. Pharaoh, Paro, Pera. You hear the P, the R, the A. Okay, those sounds go back to the Egyptian. Now, the Egyptian word from Old Kingdom text, and we're talking 2686 BC through 2160 BCE. This is called Old Kingdom in most of the standard works. And all the way back into that time, this word, Pera, wasn't really used for an individual like the king of Egypt. It was really used to signify the great house. So that Egyptian word is looking for the great house, right? That's what it means. But it's used in the earliest text to signify the royal palace. Again, Old Kingdom text, and this is what I've discovered in my studies, Old Kingdom texts aren't really associating at that time Pera with an individual, but more with the great house, the royal palace, if you will. Now, we do know, interestingly enough, that from Egyptian records from the 18th dynasty, again, we're talking 1550 to 1295 BCE, that during this time, 18th dynasty, and not before, the word Pera becomes for the first time, according to the experts, associated with the Egyptian ruler. Now, this time, the 18th dynasty, as I've defined it, 1550 to 1295 BCE, fits our period of time according to 1 Kings 6, the Tyrian Assyria rulers list, and so forth, based on Josephus and others. This is our time. Now, a name in text from this period, a name is generally not associated with the title. Remember now, it's only in this time that Pera becomes tied to a person, the king, the ruler. And generally, it's not hooked to a name. So my question was, would we expect, say from the Bronze Age, middle to late Bronze Age, would we expect a document that purports to be written at that time to say Pharaoh so-and-so? And the answer to that is no. So it fits that we have the word Pera, but we don't get the name attached to it, meaning it doesn't mean that we don't know names or that we don't have names for these people, but we do know that at this time it was just generally not recorded, the name with the title. You might read about the name of that person, you might read the title, but generally not together. Now, this continues into what we call the Ramesside period, which follows the 18th dynasty. The Ramesside period picks up in 1295 BC and runs on to about 1069 BCE. Now, we have names again, but Pharaoh, Pera, is all that needs to be recorded to make a check mark by and say, yeah, that's pretty much what you expect in that time. Now, again, you don't expect in this period to see Pharaoh so-and-so or so-and-so king of Egypt, but we do see that at a later period. So if we would have seen Pharaoh so-and-so, it might be suspect. Because when do we really start seeing a name associated with the title? Go with me to Jeremiah, give you an example here. Go to Jeremiah 46 in verse 2. Jeremiah 46 and verse 2 says this, concerning Egypt, about the army of Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, which was at the river Euphrates near Carchemish, and was defeated by King Nebuchadrezzar of Babylon in the 4th year of King Jehoiakim, son of Josiah of Judah. So here we've got a text during the time of Josiah where Pharaoh Necho is mentioned. Now, look at 1 Kings chapter 14, another example of naming a king either with the title king. If you look at 1 Kings 14:25, again, look at, let's see, make sure it's verse 25. In the 5th year of King Rehoboam, King Shishak of Egypt marched against Jerusalem and carried off the treasure of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. So again, you're looking at the time of Solomon's son, monarchy, sort of early monarchy up until the close of the biblical period. You see kings mentioned by name associated with the title. But in a text purporting to be when roughly we believe the Exodus to take place, you're not necessarily going to expect to see that. Now, we know a few other details that I want to bring into our story as we begin to look at this contest. It's really a contest or a confrontation between Moses and Aaron, and of course God, and Pharaoh, we don't know his name. We're looking at a few other details that I want to bring to your attention. So for instance, we know in the 18th dynasty, dates 1550 to 1295 BCE, Egypt has a professional army, a good one, a standing army, a strong army, and that between this period of time, 1550 BC and 1069 BCE, we have examples of foreigners being enslaved. And we don't get a lot of that in other periods, but we do see it in the time frame that we're concerned with. So this is another piece to the puzzle. I'm giving you broad, definitive pieces to put into the story. We have in some of these lists of names have been shown to be Semitic names. So sometimes you can look at these name lists that are from Egyptian documents from this period that we're concerned with, and you see slaves' names, and some of these are Semitic names. We also know that these slaves during this time, based on Egyptian records, were tasked with major building projects. They were utilized as slave labor to build these building projects for the Egyptians. Now, we have text. What I'm basically telling you is we have text from Egyptian records, which in many ways demonstrate similarities between what we know historically and what we find in the biblical text. We see corroboration one between the other, and so I wanted to give you that first of all. Now I'm going to give you a couple of specific examples that I have in my notes, and so I'm going to be following closely to my notes for a couple of these examples. But I want you to get these details down. So there is a text that is called the Louvre, L-O-U-V-E, leather roll. The Louvre, right, the museum. The Louvre leather roll reports a shortfall in brick-making quota. It's an Egyptian text. It's written on leather. And in this particular text, which is dated later than I think the Exodus, but it still ties in with our biblical story, so I want to bring it up, dates to about 1274 BCE. So again, I think that's after the Exodus has already happened. But in this particular record, in the Louvre leather roll, Peripedget, I don't know if I'm saying his Egyptian or his name properly. He's the son of Pasur. He fails to deliver his quota of 2,000 bricks. So in this particular document, dating to 1274 BCE, Pentateuch is in trouble. By the way, you can Google that and look that up. Roughly, this is from the 5th year of Ramesses II. The same text, this Louvre leather roll, mentions that there are certain religious holidays that are allowed for these workers. It was like a union, right? You know, they could have off certain religious holidays in their enslavement even. It's interesting. Well, it's interesting to our biblical story because, as you know, in the story of Shemot, in the story of Exodus, the children of Israel, particularly Moses and Aaron, one of the things they request is, hey, we want to keep this religious festival. You know, and you think, well, is that out of line for them to request? Not according to what we know from history. We know, at least in a period that's a little bit later than our period, that religious holidays were granted at times. Now, there's another record. This particular text was found at Deir el Medina, and it just mentions that the writer tells us, the scribe tells us that the workers have gone to offer to their God. They're off on holiday break. Where are your workers, sir? Well, they're off offering to their God, you know. Another religious holiday. This is an Egyptian text. Now, one text that I've have in my file over this period of time, because I'm still searching deeply in text, not only biblical text, but extra biblical materials that relate to the text. So I have this in my file. I think it's of great importance and great interest. There is this tomb painting. It's on the wall of a tomb. This particular person is named Rekhmire. Rekhmire is the way it's represented in English. And this particular person, on the tomb wall of this particular person, it shows people of a Semitic origin, and they're engaged in brick making. So in other words, and again, this is not something that a writer just made up, and we don't have any evidence for the fact that there were people of Semitic origin who were in Egypt. We have their names. We have some of their names. Outside the Bible, I'm talking. We know that they were used to make bricks. We know that they were held to a certain quota. We know that it wasn't unreasonable to request off for certain religious holidays if you wanted to keep Passover or something like that. You know, of course, that wasn't there yet, but if you did, right? So in this particular drawing, this relief on the wall of this tomb or this painting, it shows them, how are they making bricks? Well, they're scooping water. They're adding the water to the soil. They're mixing it up. And they're also putting straw in it. So we get this picture that begins to emerge. In this case, a real picture on a tomb wall. We can go look at this historically accurate detail, and it enhances our understanding of the biblical text. Now, by the way, this guy, Rekhmire, is from the time of a pharaoh known as Thutmose III. Thutmose III. And this particular pharaoh, according to most of the experts, is from his reign is from 1479 to 1425. All right? Except that he assumes the position of Pharaoh young, and so there is an overlap, what we call co-regencies. Now this gets, believe me, you can get into this stuff and your eyes will gloss over unless you're really, really into it. So, but during the first 22 years, he's co-regent with his aunt / you have to put / aunt / stepmother. All right? And this particular, her name is Hatshepsut. Now, she and Tutmosis III reigned together for the first 22 years, and then the last 2 years of his reign, he has one of his sons as his co-regent for 2 years. The reason he does that is because his eldest son dies. Now, how does the firstborn die? I don't know. But our time, 1479 to 1425 BC, the life of this Tutmosis III, falls into our period. Now, I will tell you this. If you look up Tutmosis III, you'll also find that one of the other dating, remember I tell you they debate over these dates. I say 1479 to 1425 is one view. Another view puts you at 1504 to 1450. See how the slide rule moves a little bit? But, and this is a key point, we're only talking about a slight shift, and there's a reason for it in Egyptian chronology, which is outside the scope of my class today. And we have other ancient Egyptian texts that I want to bring into the mix, just so you have them in your notes. You can go study this on your own. Remember, this class, I want to take you deeper, further, give you more background than just your standard, here's Torah reading Va'era, because I've done that for years and years and years. You can go back and listen to those if that's your preference, but we want to understand the text. We're looking closely and looking and pulling in all these other details. Now, there's an Egyptian text that is called or known as Anastasi. Anastasi 4 is the one that I want to bring up at this point. Look it up. It records a complaint by an official about a lack of two things that are needed to make bricks. Imagine you're a foreman in Egypt. You go, excuse me, what do you need to make bricks? You say, well, you're going to need straw and you're going to need people. And in Anastasi 4, this particular person is complaining about a lack of both. Well, how do you think the brick making is going to go? Not very well. And that's why we have other texts where this is a common thing where somebody else, I told you earlier, complained that so-and-so didn't meet his quota of 2,000 bricks. Now, how often do you have to do that? I don't think the text tells us if it's a week or, but you got to be making some bricks. They expected. Let's see what you got there, Mordecai. After God, with this background, after God met Moses at Horeb, and he tells Moses to go before Pharaoh, and he tells Moses that he is going to use Moses to free Israel from Egypt. It was after this time we read this interesting story about Aaron leaving Egypt. I want you to let this sink in. Moses is at Horeb. We're in Exodus chapter 4. And he goes and he finds Moses. He leaves Egypt. He goes to Horeb and finds Moses. Now, I use this as, again, one of the things we're looking for as we study this, at least to consider what are some possibilities. Where is he going? Where is Horeb? If you look at chapter 4 and verse 12, what's going on in context is God has just told Moses, you're going to be the person who helps free Israel from Egypt. Moses, one of his complaints is, I can't speak well, or however we translate, I'm a man heavy of speech, heavy of tongue. And so here's what God tells him in 4:12. Now go, and I will be with you as you speak, and will instruct you what to say. But he said, please, O Lord, make someone else your agent. Send someone else. And Jehovah became angry with Moses, and he said, there is your brother Aaron the Levite. Now remember, this is the first we've heard of Aaron by name. He, I know, speaks readily. Even now he is setting out to meet you, and he will be happy to see you. Now this is interesting. It goes into talk about how God is going to give a message to Moses. Moses is going to pass the message to Aaron. And basically, they're going to act this out wherever they go, particularly to Pharaoh, where Moses is going to represent God and Aaron is going to be his prophet. So that's the way that they're going to do this. It says it right here. He will serve as your spokesman, verse 16, and you will be l'Elohim, for a God for him. All right, so that's the way it's going to go down. Now, again, Moses is at Sinai. He's at Horeb. And Aaron is leaving Egypt, and he's going to go meet. Now, how does he know? And some people could say, well, God's going to show him. God's going to direct him. I'm not denying that. I'm just saying he knows exactly where to go. And he goes there. Now, look at chapter 4, verse 27. The Lord said to Aaron, Jehovah said to Aaron, this is sort of tied with what we just read, go to meet Moses in the wilderness. And now he's in Egypt. And he went and met him at the mountain of God and he kissed him. Now that's sort of a condensed, you think about it. Where, depending on how far he's got to go, is it a month? Is it just a couple of days? And he kissed him. And then Moses told Aaron about all the things that Jehovah had committed to him and all the signs about which he had instructed him. And then Moses and Aaron went and assembled all the elders of the Israelites. Well, that's condensed too. They're at Horeb, and then, so what happens is Aaron finds Moses at Horeb, finds Moses. Moses tells Aaron everything that God's told him. Then I guess what it says is the people, Moses and Aaron, they go assemble the elders of Israel. Where are they? They're in Egypt. Presumably, I don't think Aaron brought them with him. Doesn't say he did, so he goes back to Egypt. And then verse 30, Aaron repeated all the words that Jehovah had spoken to Moses. So they act out what they're told. Moses doesn't talk to them, not according to this. Here, Aaron has heard everything from Moses, and Moses is standing by him. All the elders are in front. Aaron gives the message. Aaron repeated all the words Jehovah had spoken to Moses, and he, who's he? Performed the signs in the sight of the people. We already know what those signs are. We read that. And the people were convinced when they heard that Jehovah had taken note of the Israelites and that he had seen their plight. They bowed low in homage. Now I find this very interesting, and you'll see why shortly. Moses tells Aaron about the meeting. They go before, and notice it says that they believed. When they acted out the signs, the miracles, it says that the people believed the message that Moses, and they're happy. They're excited because now they get to be free. That's the way the story reads. Remember in chapter 4, verse 1, look back at 4:1, when Moses begins to complain or try to make excuses, he says in chapter 4:1, Moses spoke up and said, what if they don't believe me and don't listen to me, but say Jehovah did not appear to you? And then God gives him these signs and says, look, if they don't believe the first one, then do the second one. And then if they don't believe the second one, do the third one. The point is, they're going to believe you. And according to 4 verse 31, they do believe him. And they seem to be excited about the fact that God's taken notice of them. All right, now keep that in your head. Now, chapter 5. They've already met with the elders. They go to now who? They go to Pharaoh. We don't know his name. Some people say this, some people say that. They go to a Pharaoh. We don't know his name, but that's okay because in the 18th dynasty, in the period where we're talking about 1550 to 1295 BCE, you're not going to expect to find that. It's only later. Now, they go to the Pharaoh. Look at chapter 5, verse 1 and 2. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went and said to Pharaoh, thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, Shalakatami, let my people go, that they may celebrate a festival to me in the wilderness. Remember, we have Egyptian records that say you can request time off for religious preferences. You may not get them, but you can. We do have texts that say that people are off doing their religious thing. Verse 2, but Pharaoh said, who is Jehovah, that I should heed him and let Israel go? I don't know Jehovah, nor will I let Israel go. He doesn't know. He's not heard this name. He probably heard a lot of different gods' names. This person says, well, I'm a Seventh-day Adventist, Pharaoh. We need time off on Saturdays. And he's like, oh, my. And somebody else says, well, we're Catholic. We need this day. And he's like, God, I mean, what day? And you have all these different reasons for these foreigners to get off work. But he doesn't know Jehovah. He says, I don't know Jehovah, and I'm not letting you go. Okay, now I want to break into the story and share something with you that I find quite interesting when we talk about sources. We've shown, I feel, fairly well that we do have different sources that have come into the text that we now have as the biblical text, with different sources that were used. And thank God we do. I love all these sources. Well, this is an interesting exercise, and I want you to do it with me today. I want to compare Exodus 3 with Exodus 6. And I'm just going to hit it high level, because what I really want to do is I want you to then go back this week in your spare time, and I want you to take on a piece of paper and you draw a line down the middle and you put Exodus 3 on the top of one side and Exodus 6 on the top of the other. And then you look for similarities, okay? I'll give you a quick rundown. In chapter 3 of Exodus, I'm not going to read this to you. I want to just hit the high points that I have in my notes and that I came across from an exercise I did a long time ago. Exodus 3:6 says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. This is where God meets Moses and the first time. So he says, I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, so forth and so on. Verse 7 says, I have marked well the plight of my people. High-level overview off the top of my head, not quoting here. You get the gist. I know that the people of Israel have been treated badly. I've heard their cry. I know about the taskmasters. I know all of this, and I have come down to rescue them. Exodus chapter 3. Exodus 4, Moses says, hey, what if they don't believe me? I'm going to go to them. I'm going to say, God met with me, and, how's this going to go? And he says, I'm not a man of words. And then verse 31, by the end of it, what happens? The people believed him. They did believe him. They accepted his words. Exodus chapter 6. In Exodus chapter 6, Moses' encounter with God. He says, I'm Jehovah. I appeared to the fathers as El Shaddai. But they didn't know me by this name, Jehovah. But it's still, I'm not going to go into that today. I've done that enough. But it's basically in Exodus 3, he says, I'm God of your fathers. In Exodus 6, I'm the God of your fathers. Different name, but I'm the God of your fathers. Exodus 6, verse 5, I've heard the moaning of the children of Israel. What are they moaning about? The taskmasters. It's basically the same as what we read in Exodus chapter 3. Chapter 6, verse 6 through 8, he says, I'm going to free you from the labors of Egypt. You're going to be my people. I will be your God. I'm going to bring you to the land. Very similar to what we read in Exodus 3. But when Moses tells this to the Israelites, the people didn't listen. Remember, when he gets this message in Exodus 3, he tells them, and they believe him. Exodus 6, interestingly enough, he tells a very similar message to the people, and they didn't listen. Why didn't they listen? Let's look at it. Exodus chapter 6, and let's look at... I'm looking for, let's see. Okay, let's look at this. So then in verse 8, I will bring you into the land which I swore to give Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and I'll give it to you as a possession. I, Jehovah. But when Moses told this to the Israelites, they wouldn't listen to Moses. Their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. Remember, just right before, they believed him and they were happy that God had taken note. Now, look at verse 10. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Go and tell Pharaoh, king of Egypt, to let the Israelites depart from the land. But Moses appealed to the Lord, saying, The Israelites won't listen to me. Sounds similar to Exodus 3. How then should Pharaoh heed me, a man of impeded speech? So the Lord spoke to both Moses and Aaron in regard to the Israelites and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, instructing them to deliver the Israelites from the land of Egypt. I want you to carefully this week study these two. They appear, interestingly enough, to be very similar in detail. Worded differently, similar pattern. God introduces himself to Moses by name, referencing the fathers. God knows about the suffering of the children of Israel in Egypt. Do I have that in both accounts? Yes, yes. In one, go tell the people, he does. He complains about not being able to speak properly. He does that in both. In Exodus 3, he uses the language that says he's heavy of lip and heavy of tongue and so forth. And in Exodus 6, he uses a different way to describe it. This time he says, I'm of uncircumcised lips. In one, the people gladly hear his message, they're happy. In another, they don't believe him, their spirits crushed from hard bondage. I propose that this is an interesting example, an interesting exercise that I want you to work through. This idea, in fact, just so you have it in your notes, in chapter 6, verse 10 through 13, where it says a man of impeded speech, this is where it's referenced to, look this up in Hebrew, it's uncircumcised of lip. Now you're going to be reminded, of course, of other prophets who had to be convinced to go. Isaiah is one example. Jeremiah chapter 1. Remember, God reaches out, literally it says, and touches his mouth, Jeremiah chapter 1. You'll think about these. And remember Isaiah, in Isaiah 6, when he has a vision, he mentions this idea. He doesn't say of uncircumcised lips, but he dwells among a people of uncircumcised. Look it up, right? Isaiah chapter 6. I'll leave some of this on the table for you to mop up later. Now, interesting, here we're gonna roll through a few more points. You get into chapter 6, verse 14. In verse 14 through 25, you have a partial genealogy. It's weird. If you look at, the following are the heads of their respective clans. The sons of Reuben. You start off, you're dealing with the oldest, but you don't go all the way through. You just stop, because the writer is pulling this, we believe, from another list, because he's only, or he or she, whoever the scribe is only interested in getting us to Moses and Aaron, right? So you go through, if you look at 14 through 25, this particular genealogy. Now, this is the first time we learned the names of the father and mother of Moses. We didn't get them at the beginning of Exodus, but here we read in a genealogical table, verse 20, Amram took to wife his father's sister Jochebed, and she bore him Aaron and Moses. And the span of Amram's life was 137 years. Wait a minute. Where's Miriam? Now, I know a lot of you are saying, but Ross, we know in these genealogies, a lot of times they just don't mention women. Well, is that the case here? Let's look at verse 23. Aaron took to wife Elisheva, that's a woman, daughter of Amminadab, that's a woman, and sister of Nachshon. And she bore him Nadav, Abihu, Eleazar, and Itamar. And then skip down to verse 5. And Aaron's son, Eleazar, took to wife one of Putiel's daughters, and she bore him Pinchas. And you continue to go through. Now, the question becomes, why is Miriam not mentioned here? It doesn't have to be anything sinister, but I just want to draw your attention to that as we work through. Now, we are now coming to the place where we're dealing with the great confrontation. All of this is just background for the great confrontation, which will extend into next week's class, because we're going to work through what are called the plagues. The plagues. Now, are these miracles, natural phenomena? Did they even happen? I mean, there are different views put forward by this. Some say, well, it's a story, Ross, it never happened. Deuteronomy doesn't mention them, but that's okay. Doesn't mean that they didn't happen. But the question, when we look at this, if we're talking about these particular plagues, how many were there? Everybody write down on a piece of paper right now, how many were there? All right, everybody's written 10. Good. Because if you read Exodus, Exodus does in fact have 10. The 10 plagues. If you've ever sat through a Passover Seder, you're going to work through the Haggadah and you're going to read about the 10 plagues. Everybody knows that. It's like who's buried in Grant's tomb. It's one of those trick questions. How many plagues are in the 10 plagues? Well, if you read Exodus, you're going to come up with 10 plagues. They go from the beginning of chapter 7 through chapter 12, verse 36. And here they are. I've got to go through this quickly. Number 1, water to blood. Number 2, frogs. Number 3, lice, gnats. Number 4, swarms. Number 5, pestilence. Number 6, boils. Number 7, hail and fire. Combined by the Baptist into one word, hell, fire. Number 8, locust. Number 9, darkness. And number 10, the plague of the firstborn. Now, if you go to Psalm 78, Psalm 78, poetic, it's a psalm of Asaph, gives a different list in different order. But I want you to, again, make you a little chart. On the left, Exodus 10, work through these. I know I'm giving a lot of homework this week. In the middle column, you're going to write Psalm 78. Put Asaph in parentheses if you want to look just like my chart. Then you read through those. Here are the order and the number according to Psalm 78. Number 1, water to blood. Number 2, swarms, insects. Number 3, frogs. Number 5, locusts. Number 6, hail. Number 7, hail again, combined with beast, the death of a lot of beasts. Number 8, the firstborn. And then if you go to Psalm 105, you get another list. Now, by the way, there's a lot of similarities between these lists, but I want you to look at them because these are ancient records of the 10 plagues. And what we're studying right now is the historicity and the ancient memories that the biblical writers gave us. Look, Asaph wanted us to know his list. I want to read his list. I want to read Exodus 7 through Exodus 12:36. I want to know what that writer said. I also want to know what Psalm 105 says. Number 1, darkness. Number 2, waters to blood. By the way, the fish die according to Psalm 105. I want you to know that. Number 3, frogs. Number 4, swarms, insects. Number 5, hail, fire. Puts them together. Number 6, locusts. Number 7, the firstborn. Now the question is, a lot of people have said, I know you've read this, that the plagues are strikes against Egypt's gods. You ever read that? You know, and that's a pretty good theory. A lot of writers, a lot of researchers have said this. And that list works a lot. In other words, you can find correlations between some of these plagues and what they represent and the gods that are tied to these Egyptian gods and so forth. But it's only partial agreement. So like you don't find necessarily, you can't go down and go, yep, that's this God, yep, that's that God, got him, all 10 or 7 or 8, depending on which list you're working off of. But the idea is that there is some agreement between the two. Now, what Hofmeyr suggests, Hofmeyr, some of you probably are familiar with his work. Hofmeyr puts this theory forward that I think is at least interesting and deserves a close look, is that the attack, the plagues, if you will, are aimed at Pharaoh. Now, there are correlations, there are associations with the gods, but really the thing that you have to do is knock Pharaoh on his backside in front of the people, and that's what God's doing with the plagues. How so? Because one of the things that the king of Egypt, now this goes way back, many, many years before even the text of the Old Kingdom. Remember that date that I gave you is 2686 to 2160 BCE. Even in Old Kingdom text, the king is responsible, the Pharaoh, Paro, is responsible to maintain Ma'at. Ma'at. Well, it's hard to define Ma'at, but the concept can be defined. It really deals with order, and it deals with order on a cosmic scale, but it also deals with order, Ma'at deals with order on a social scale too. So like if you have bad stuff, rioting in the streets and social order is all screwed up, that person has not maintained Ma'at. All right? And then if the storms are coming at greater intensity and bad things are happening and you have, for instance, hail destroying your cattle, it's a sign to the people that the Pharaoh lost control of Ma'at. He's not in control of the social order. So by God doing these particular events, now some people argue that they're all caused by natural phenomena. Well, whatever. But the people would view these bad things as no Ma'at. There's not Ma'at going on here. We have texts, by the way. We have reliefs in ancient Egyptian reliefs that show the king presenting the goddess named Ma'at, meant to represent this idea of social order and cosmic order, presenting Ma'at to the chief deity of the pantheon, basically to Amun-Ra, is here's Ma'at. Like the king is promising to the people, just like all politicians. This stuff goes back thousands of years. They say the same thing. They don't have Ma'at, being presented to the chief god necessarily, but they're going to tell you, I'm going to fix this, I'm going to fix that, I'm going to fix this, and every one of them put a different name on the hat, and it's the same story. Everyone knew that as long as cosmic catastrophe or basic order was maintained, that the Pharaoh had kept his promises, his campaign promises, his assuming the role of Pharaoh promises. Everything is going lovely. Ma'at is stored up. Now, the king is going to take credit for that, right? If you're not having hail kill your cattle, the king has every right to say, look at my term. There aren't bad things happening. So he's going to take credit for that. Well, guess what happens? If bad stuff does happen, guess who takes responsibility for it? The Pharaoh. You got to take the good with the bad, as they say. Now, in chapter 7, as these begin, as these blows, as the Hebrew Bible calls them, plagues, like blow one right after another, you encounter this particular, you're reminded of what we read in Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 7 begins, I put you for God to Pharaoh. I put you for God, and Aaron's your prophet. So when they go in there, the showdown, the confrontation is between the team, Moses, Aaron, and Jehovah, versus Egypt, particularly Pharaoh. We have these battles that take place. Remember, in the beginning of chapter 7, we have they throw their staffs down. Remember, and when this particular engagement takes place, the staff on our side turns into a what? We say a serpent, and the other Egyptian magicians, hey, so that's nothing. They throw their staffs down. They too become, we say, serpents, and then the serpent for the Israelite side eats the serpents, and everybody oohs and ahs. Now, interestingly enough, one of the signs in Exodus 4 that Moses gets is God tells him, what's that in your hand, Moses? That's my stick, throw it down. He throws it down. It becomes, it says, a nakash, a serpent, and he recoils from it. It scares him. I know what he's like. I mean, I'm scared of snakes too, so I get that. Here, the word is tanim, which generally, tananim, generally means a dragon or a crocodile. So did his staff turn into a snake or a crocodile? Well, Exodus 4, clearly it's a nakash, it's a snake. But here, it seems to be more of a crocodile. Crocodile eats the other, all right? Now, you go, well, why does that matter? Well, I don't know that it matters. I'm okay if your image is he turns it into a snake. That doesn't bother me so much. But what is interesting, though, is that in Ezekiel 29:3, for instance, this is a much later period, but Pharaoh is referred to as a crocodile. Basically, that comparison. So what this signifies is that there's a bigger croc. You think you're God. You think you're the top dog, but here's Moses and Aaron. Our God's bigger, our God's stronger, so forth and so on. Now, these Egyptians in Egypt, I'm going to set the stage for next week's class by telling you that these Egyptians, Egyptian magicians, that's almost a tongue twister, are called Khartoum. In Hebrew, it's Het Resh Tet Mem, Khartoum. This particular word is also used, remember in Genesis 48, where, again, in Egypt, the setting is Egypt, and Joseph, the dreams, and they bring in the magicians, these guys, the Khartoum. But it's also in Daniel. You get this word again, Daniel 1, verse 20, and chapter 2, verse 2. So who are these Khartoum? Het Resh Tet Mem. The Egyptian records record a similar word, and I'm going to read this off my notes. Heritep, you see the het, the sounds of the het, the resh, the T sound, and then they call it Hertep and Hep. And these are highly educated. They're mentioned in ancient Egyptian writings. They're associated with the house of life, these magicians, if you will. They're attached to the temple cult. They're mainly responsible for ritual, magic, the passing on of these ritualistic things. They also do medicine, astronomy. They're kind of all-around guys. I don't know that they're all men, but generally in the text they seem to be presented as men. Everybody's scared of them. I mean, these, you don't want to get this group on your bad side. They can put a hex on you, a curse, and these are the people that Moses and Aaron are basically up against. Now, one point that I want to use to set the stage for next week's class, because even though we get 6 of the blows or plagues this week, I don't want to split that up. I'm going to talk more about that next week, but I do want to set one thing up for us, because a lot of people talk about the heart of Pharaoh. God hardens his heart. You ever heard that? And you think, well, what chance did he have? I mean, if God hardens his heart, then is that fair to Pharaoh, to Paro? You say, well, God can do anything, like Paul said later. Right? God can do it. Who are you to question? Well, I'm sorry. I want to know, is that really right? Did God harden his heart? Well, one thing I want you to know is that there's a lot that is riding on Pharaoh's heart in this particular story. And when I say story, I mean from chapter 7 through chapter 12. Sometimes his heart is called hard. And that's kashah in Hebrew, that verb, to harden. Sometimes it's chazak, strong. And then other times you have to question, is Pharaoh making his own heart hard? 5 times in the text we read that Pharaoh strengthened or hardened his own heart. In other words, he becomes resolved. This, and here are the verses, you can look these up. Chapter 7, verse 14, chapter 8, verse 11, which is 15 in the English. I'll make sure that, I know John Baruch is going to write these down. Chapter 7, verse 28, verse 32 in the English. Chapter 9, verse 7, and chapter 9, verse 34 all deal with Pharaoh hardening, strengthening his own heart. God's not doing this yet. But then in chapter 10, verse 1, look at 10:1. This is where I want to take you just to make this point. Then the Lord said, Jehovah said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the heart of his courtiers, in order that I may display these signs among them. But prior to this, 5 times, he hardened his heart, he strengthened his heart, he hardened his... In other words, he's like, you will not budge me. You will not break me. You will not bend me. And God said, okay. He strengthens his resolve. Now, and by the way, in ancient Egyptian sources, we see this idea of a heavy heart. And it's in interesting ways it's presented. So one depiction is the Egyptian god Anubis is bringing, he's escorting a dead person through the hall of what's called the two Ma'at. Remember we talked about Ma'at, social order and cosmic order. So Anubis is bringing this dead person there. And in the depiction, the person's heart is on a scale, right? So what's it being weighed against? What's the heart of this dead person being weighed against? Ma'at. You know what Ma'at is represented as? A feather. So if you go in here, Anubis brings you in, your heart is weighed in the scale versus the feather of Ma'at. You know what that means? It means you better walk a tight line in your life. Because if your heart is heavy with sin, it drops down and a monster eats you, basically. It's kind of a bad view of God, but, you know. That's the idea of the afterlife. It's part of the Book of the Dead. So we're going to talk, though, about these plagues, these blows, and we're going to go blow by blow beginning next week through this particular story. But I want you to know that Egyptian records provide insight into the biblical accounts and confirm many of the details that we find written in the text. Now, still yet, and thankfully so, due to differing accounts that are preserved within the biblical text as we have received it, we know that these different sources are used. I mean, we see that in the text. You compare things, you notice. It's not our job to conflate stories or to make these meld into one or to even consider ourselves champions of some noble cause by defending things which clearly are from separate sources. The work of the apologist today has done more damage by not truly examining the text. So I want to look at all of this. I want to look at it carefully. And next week, we're going to continue with the confrontation between Moses and Aaron and God on one side, and that is now known and will forever be hereafter known as Jehovah. But this God, whose name was not known to Pharaoh, and perhaps wasn't known to the patriarchs either, is going in next week's class to make a name for himself, a name that is his eternal name throughout all generations, from Horeb forward. Join me next week. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov. Welcome to 2022.